Check, check. Okay. All right, everybody, we're going to get started with Sunday school. Yeah. Yes. Serena, do you want to explain what it is to people? Okay. All right. Before we get started, this was probably a couple months ago or a month ago. I passed this thing around and took an offering for the young adult group that meets on Saturday nights. I think they're doing a great job, and you all really gave, which was nice. And Serena is a part of the young adult group, and she has an opportunity she wants to share.
So, Kevin, when you originally told us about the offering going to the young adults group, because we don't really have a fund, we were super excited, and the thought had been that maybe some of that could go towards funds like a retreat if we ever did one. Camp Sela has a young adults retreat called Tri-State Connection or something like that. And it's a weekend of just scripture, time in prayer, hanging out, campfires. And so since we're fairly new as a group, we were like, well, maybe we won't plan our own event and just go to the one that they have provided. So right now we're just trying to gauge who all would be wanting to come. It's $100 per person to go. So part of our thought was that if there is any of the funds that come from the Sunday school class, giving students who want to go, maybe not students, whatever we are, $10 to $20 off of the fee for going. So just to help others who may want to go but not financially be able to have that choice. So, yeah.
All right, so I'm going to pass this around over here. You can just pass it around, and if you do have some extra dollars or something, you could put them in there. All right, well, let's begin with prayer. God, I thank you for the book of Genesis and for the whole Bible and for the truth that's in it, but also the encouragement and how you build us up and how you're always faithful. And I pray that you'd help us to be faithful people who follow what you've called us to do. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so we are into Genesis 12, and I'm going to start moving us forward at a little faster of a pace starting today, because otherwise we will never finish Genesis. The Detroit Lions were pretty good last year, weren't they? Which was surprising to me because I remember some pretty bad years. But they've never won a Super Bowl. Still have never won, even though they had Barry Sanders, probably one of the greatest football players ever. They had a decent season last year, and I think they're 1-1 right now. Is that right? Some of you might know. But let's just say they start playing great. And everybody in the state of Michigan gets their hopes up, and people who didn't care about the Lions start caring, and we're all thinking they might win they might win the Super Bowl. And let's just imagine, they get to the playoffs, and in the first game, they have two people on the offensive line get injured. Two of their best people get injured, and they barely win the game. Okay? The next game in the playoffs, the refs just missed several calls against the opposing team, and then they're calling the Lions for every touch and every hold and every pass interference that they can. But they pull off they squeak out this spectacular win in the last quarter, and they get to the conference finals. And both of their kickers get injured in the first half, and so they have to, every fourth down, they have to go for it, and every 2-point conversion they have to do, and somehow they just, even though everything seemed to go wrong, they win in the last quarter. They get to the Super Bowl, and they're facing the Kansas City Chiefs, who have won, I think, twice in a row or something like that. And at the Super Bowl, the Lions are up 7. It's the third quarter, and the quarterback gets sacked so hard that he's knocked unconscious. What's the coach going to do? The team starts going down. They're down by 7. It's the fourth quarter. They've got a backup quarterback. It's 4th and 45, and there's 3 minutes left. And the coach, geniusly, Sets up like they're going to punt with 3 minutes left, and instead he pulls off this crazy trick play. They put it in the end zone, and they win. Everything went wrong. Everything got much more difficult than it should have been, but they completed their goal. That's like the Bible. That's in a lot of ways like Genesis. God has a goal to redeem the heavens and the earth, to make it his kingdom. But he's going against human sin and depravity. He's going against the spiritual forces of evil. And God chooses Abraham as his quarterback for the first game of the playoffs, so to speak. And everything seems to go wrong in Abraham's story. Thing after thing happens that just, and Abraham himself, more than anything else, gets in the way of God completing his goal. But God comes through again and again. He is the real hero, even though he's the coach. He's the real hero of the Bible. But after that, as the story of the team of Israel, so to speak, goes on, more things happen. God comes through again with Moses in Egypt. They were playing those Egyptians, and they were difficult people, but God whoops them, right? Again and again, he comes through. Joshua and Israel defeat the Canaanites. God delivers David from the hands of Saul and from Goliath. Elijah and the prophets go up against Baal and other idols, and God delivers in miraculous ways. The challenge of Assyria and Babylon and Persia and the monster Rome coming after God's people, and God brings them through. So many setbacks, so many obstacles, so many things that just seem to go wrong, and yet God's plan, his goal, continues on. And in the final match, God saves the day. He defeats Satan using a play that no one saw coming, though they should have. He sent his own son to die on the cross, to be resurrected from the dead. And through impossible odds, God comes through and wins. Right? God wins. It's cool. I mean, this is not a sports game. It's much bigger than a sports game, but you can see how even though everything seems to go wrong, God makes it happen. Now, in Abraham's time, where we're at, God does some truly spectacular things. He makes good on his promises, despite the things that happen. There were 3 promises that God made to Abraham. He said, and this is the beginning of chapter 12, he promises him an heir. He promises him a son. He says, I will make you into a great nation. How do you make someone into a great nation if they don't have any kids, right? So he promises that. He promises an inheritance to Abram. Not only will he have a son, but his descendants will inherit the promised land. This is going to come through. He's going to have a child, and he and his children are going to inherit the promised land. And then the final promise is God promises him a heritage. I will make your name great, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. He promises those things in a covenant to Abraham. And through the promises, God is going to fulfill his original intention to put his kingdom on heaven and earth, to dwell together with people in close relationship, right? For people to be his priests and his image bearers, filling the earth with holiness in his presence. So over and over again, throughout Genesis, God comes up big when the promises are on the line. And there's a lot of times. With every story, there seems to be some new threat, some new problem. And God confirms and fulfills his promises. So this is what we're going to do, and this is what I mean by going a little bit quicker. We're going to read through some stories in chapter 12, 13, and 14. We might get into 15, I'm not sure. And I want you to tell me, as we look at this story, what's the threat to the covenant promises? I want you to look for what's the obstacle that God has to overcome in order to, 1, give Abraham an heir, 2, inherit the promised land that he promised, the land of Canaan, and 3, to promise him a heritage to make his name great and all peoples will be blessed through him. So look for those things. Before we do that, we're going to set the stage, though. Look at chapter 12. This is verse 4 through 9. I'm going to read it, chapter 12, verses 4 through 9. So Abram went, as the Lord told him. He went to the land, that is. And Lot went with him. Abram was about 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they'd accumulated, and the people they acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I'll give this land." So he built an altar there to the Lord, who had appeared to him. From there he went on toward the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent, and with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east, there he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. Then Abram set out and continued toward the Negev. So I want to point out some things. Before Abraham gets what God has promised, all these things, Abraham's already 75 years old. He doesn't have a child yet. Now, people did live longer. Abram actually lived another 100 years after this, just to be honest, but still 75 years old before he starts moving. The reason he takes his nephew Lot with him to the land is probably because he intended to make Lot his heir, since he had no children yet. That was plan A for him. This was a common thing for people to do. They'd adopt a close relative in order to pass down their inheritance so that it didn't leave the family. And so, even though God had promised to make a great nation, he had Lot in his mind for his adopted heir. Abram has lots of possessions and people already. Did you notice that? He's got a bunch of people, like slaves, that he acquired in Haran. He's got his wife. He's got Lot. He's got a ton of livestock and everything like that. Why is that a problem? Huh? Slow traveling? That would be a problem. Where's he going to put them all? He's supposed to go to the promised land. Well, people live there, right? There's not much space. He can pitch his tent and stuff, but all the wells are taken. All the space is taken up by everybody else. That's a major problem. Will there be land for him and for his people to subsist, right? To graze their cattle and things like that. Abram went first to Shechem. Shechem became a famous holy place, right? That's where Jacob ended up residing with his 12 sons and his 3 wives. 4 wives, excuse me. And the Canaanites lived in the land at that time. And here's the thing. God had promised Abram that whole land. And yet Abram didn't legally possess even an inch of it. He could put his tent places, apparently, if people allowed it. But that was difficult. And so he was going to a place where he owned no land, and he couldn't just set up anywhere. Now, Abram, when he gets to Shechem, he builds an altar to Yahweh. He's reintroducing proper worship of God in this sacred space, right? I see it as a sign. He's purifying the land. He's doing what Adam was supposed to do. He is being a priest in the Holy Land, building an altar there. But if you notice, Abraham doesn't stick in one place. He goes first to Shechem, and then he moves on to Bethel and Ai. And then he goes all the way south. The Negev was the southern desert. He moves all the way south, trying to find space. That's a problem. God had promised him this land, and there wasn't space for him to even have a household. He had to keep moving. We can see, even before this all starts, this is not going to be easy. Okay? Now, here's the story, and as I read it, I want you to look for the threat to the covenant. This is chapter 12, verses 10 through the end of the chapter. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. And as he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they'll say, 'This is his wife.' Then they will kill me, but will let you live. Say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you." When Abram came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw that Sarai was a very beautiful woman. And when Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and she was taken into his palace. He treated Abram well for her sake, and Abram acquired sheep and cattle and male and female donkeys, male and female servants and camels. But the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife Sarai. So Pharaoh summoned Abram. "What have you done to me?" he said. "Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister, so that I took her to be my wife? Now then, here's your wife, take her and go." Then Pharaoh gave orders that Abram and his men, to his men, and they sent him on his way with his wife and everything he had. Okay. Do you see a threat? Do you see an obstacle to God fulfilling what he intends with Abram in this story? And what is it? He almost lost his life because of the famine. Yes? Sarah, his wife, through whom the child is supposed to come, gets given to another person, to the Pharaoh. Okay? Here, you want a mic, probably, don't you? Can you bring the mic to Mike?
I wasn't sure if it was shouting time or not.
Yeah.
Miss Mike? Give Mike the mic. In that transition, my age and everything, I already forgot what I was going to say. But,
Yeah.
but anyway, there was the famine itself was a threat. Egypt was a threat. He gathered, he was in a foreign land and things were working pretty good. But him, who owned God's promises, lied about the thing. So lying, our own sins are a big threat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you think it was bad that he lied about this, or was this? Do you think the biblical author sees Abraham as sinning here? One time my dad, back in the old building, was preaching on an Abraham story, I think. Maybe it was this one, I don't know. And 2 Muslims had come in to listen to the service, and he said that Abraham sinned in his sermon, and that offended them just terribly. Like he did not sin. And many people have tried to figure out, even Christians, figured out how this wasn't a sin that Abram did. It was, I don't know how they do it, gymnastics, No, he was sinning. He wasn't trusting God, and he did something horrible to his wife. What a terrible thing to do to your own wife. And yet, here's the worst part. This was not the only time that Abram did it. This happened again this happens again in chapter 20 with a different king. And his son Isaac does it with his wife, Rebekah, in chapter 26. Now, it is awful, but it's not unheard of. People first of all, kings, they see a beautiful woman, and you can see this even like in the story of Esther, but this is a common thing. You see a beautiful woman, you take them for yourself, and you stick her in your harem, right? She becomes your wife. It was a way of dominating the people. And so Abraham expected that Pharaoh was going to do this. And other people did the same sorts of things that Abram did as well. This was not an unheard of thing. Now, there's a threat. Louis said, for his life. There's a famine in the promised land. Can you imagine how disappointed you might be if God promised you this land? He brought you from Haran, and he's like, come here, I'm going to give you this beautiful land, and then there's a famine. Well, Abram arrived in the land of Canaan, and we know this because of biblical archaeology. He arrived in a time of a span of 300 years of famine. Not that it was continual or always or anything like that, but we can see somehow, I'm not an archaeologist, but from the records, that there was famines all the time during this time period. And he arrived during that time. Famine occurred in Israel when it didn't rain, obviously. And there are famous stories in the Old Testament because of famines that happened. So this is one. Can you think of another? Ruth? Yep. Elijah? Though he seemed to be controlling God controlled the famine through Elijah at that time. We have a 4-season climate here in Michigan. In Israel, there's a 2-season climate. Some people have likened the climate in Israel to Southern California. So you ever been down to Southern California where it's dry and things like that? Well, there's 2 rainy seasons. There's the autumn and the spring rains, and if one of those doesn't happen, you're in big trouble. You know, famine can happen easily down there. So this famine was a threat to Abram's life, but also it made him move away from the land that God had promised. Do you think he should have just stayed and gone hungry? Yes. Maybe. That's probably easy for us to say with our well-fed breakfasts. But yes, he should have. He should have trusted God. And I think he learns to trust God later. But he moved away from the promised land. Abram's afraid that God's not going to take care of him. And like Hal said, Sarah is taken. If Pharaoh defiles her, she's already been taken. She's waiting in his harem. If he defiles her, everything's lost. Abram can't have her back. That means the promised heir is not going to come, like God had said. Now, how does God come through? He strikes Pharaoh with a disease and his household. So there's no indication about what kind of disease it was, but in the ancient world, diseases were considered always to be sent by the gods, right? And usually it was a reaction to something that had offended them. And so when people got sick, they didn't look to, how did I contract these germs from people, right? They looked to, what did I do to make the gods angry? And so doctors in the ancient world were usually trained in herbs and ointments and medications, but they were also trained in exorcisms and incantations. They were a mix between medical and spiritual. I guess you could call them witch doctor type stuff, if that's what a witch doctor does. But this sudden onset of disease, where everybody in Pharaoh's household gets sick, they knew something must have happened, and what they would have done is they would have gone to divination. They would have done their magic rituals. Maybe they would take a liver and of some animal and look at it and try to determine what it meant. But they came to the conclusion that what did I do last? Oh, I took this woman named Sarah from this guy, and she came into my harem, and then we got a disease. It must be something with that. I did something wrong. They go and talk to Abram, and they find out that Abram's God has sent diseases against everybody, right? So God comes through by sending the disease, but he does something else. What else does he do for Abram in this story? He blesses him through the whole thing. Pharaoh, he gets all of these flocks and herds from Pharaoh, and he gets to take them with him. And you can see how God continues to bless Abram, just as he promised he would in the beginning of the chapter, with favor, with protection. And even despite Abram's sin, God continues to bless him, which I find interesting. And there's something that we should see here as well, which is in ancient thinking, gods had territories, right? If you were in Babylon, you might worship Marduk or the other gods. But if you left that country, you were leaving the gods' territories, and then you would take up worship of the god you went to their land in. The God of Israel, the real God, doesn't work like that. Abram goes to Egypt, where there's all these powerful gods, and they worship, Osiris and Ammon and all those people, all those gods. But God has complete control in Egypt, just like he does in Israel. He can send diseases there just like he could in the land of Israel. And this is a precursor to what's going to happen in Exodus, when God absolutely destroys all the gods and humiliates, the gods in front of everybody's eyes. And Pharaoh also was considered a god. So, major threats averted, God's covenant continues. Okay, let's look at the next chapter. I'm going to just read a little bit of it and then I'll explain the rest. But this is chapter 13. So Abram went from Egypt to the Negev. He's back in the land. The Negev is the southern Israel. With his wife and everything he had, and Lot went with him. And Abram became very wealthy in livestock and in silver and gold. From the Negev, he went from place to place until he came to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai, where the tent was built, had been earlier, and where he had first built an altar. And Abram called on the name of the Lord. Okay, now I'm going to explain. He's in a place with Lot, but they're so wealthy. And that means they have so many animals, really. Him and Lot. And so many slaves and servants and things like that. And they have this little tiny space that they're confined to between Bethel and Ai. And so Abram's servants, the people who are over his flocks, start fighting with Lot's, who are over his flocks. And Abram, remember, Lot was very important to him. This was not only his nephew, but who he was planning to give his inheritance to if he didn't have a son. And I still don't think he had quite seen that that's what God was going to do. And he goes to Lot and he says, my people shouldn't be fighting your people. And he says, this is verse 9, is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. And if you go to the right, I'll go to the left. So here's the major problem. The promised land doesn't have enough space. Abram tries to solve the problem in verse 9 by saying, let's part company, you go left, I'll go right, or I'll go right, you go left. It's really helpful to understand how ancient people saw directions. In our mind, if I say, go north, in your mind, which direction are you going? Up. I'm going to go up north, right? Or if I say, go south, what do you say? Down south. West is left, east is right. That's not how people thought in the ancient world about maps, right? So in the ancient world, east was up. So if you were in Israel and you were going to go to China, that's up. You're going up east. West, back toward the Mediterranean Sea, was down. Left was north, and right was south. Okay? So Abram's looking at the land. I don't know how good your geography is, but if you can kind of picture the land of Israel, the promised land, that is. If he's in the middle of it, about in Bethel, he says, if you go up north, if you go to the left, then I'll go take the southern part and live there. And if you go to the southern part, I'll go up to the northern part. Why is that a problem? I mean, what's the big deal? Why is this even a story? This sounds so mundane.
There might not be as much grazing area in some.
Okay, well, that's certainly true in some places. But, Mike? Here, you want the mic? No?
That's right, just briefly. He's going closer back home. With that baby, you're going to return home.
That's interesting, yeah. God promised the whole land to Abram and his descendants. If he splits it with somebody, that's an issue, right? They're going to have that land, and Abram will not, and his descendant will not have the whole thing. This was part of the promise, right? And so he says that, and Lot looks around. Okay, this is verse 10. Lot looked around and he saw the whole plain of the Jordan toward Zoar. It was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, and Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out toward the east. And the two men parted company. Do you hear that? He said, either take north or south in the promised land. Lot looked up east, and he went right out of the promised land on the other side of the Jordan River and lived in Sodom. God threw, this was a threat, and God saw Abram through. And look what happens. Right after he goes and lives in Sodom, where the people were, this is verse 13, wicked and sinning greatly against the Lord, this is verse 14 now, the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had parted from him, look around from where you are, to the north and south, to the east and west. All the land that you see I will give you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that anyone who can count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. Go walk through the length and the breadth of the land I'm giving it to you. And so now the whole land is, even though he doesn't own it yet, even though there are still a bunch of Canaanites in it, it's all going to be his. Do you think there's any significance to Lot moving east out of the promised land? Do you, Beth? Adam and Eve, when they were pushed, exiled from the garden, they went out to the east, right? When Cain even further offended the Lord, he was pushed further east. When they made the Tower of Babel, the people were moving east, right? They're moving away from God's presence, and yet in this land where God, the sacred land where God's presence is, he's keeping people in it.
My geography does not put Sodom across the Jordan. It puts it down by the Salt Sea, which would be part of the Promised Land.
It's between the Sea of Galilee in the north and the Dead Sea, and the Jordan River goes right between them.
That's true.
Yes. And
on which side of the Dead Sea you're putting him on Sodom on the east side of the Dead Sea? Mm-hmm. As I read the books and the maps, it's on the west side of the Dead Sea, and in those cities that Lot ended up in are on the west side.
That's not what I've seen.
Okay, well
we actually don't know.
I'm not trying to debate with you, but it just is so put in me from much study that way. And if I'm wrong, I'm glad to be wrong.
Yeah. Well, I think theologically, the idea is he's moving out from Abram's land that was set for him. I think that's the idea, and especially because we know Sodom was a great wicked city where people were doing sinful, wicked things.
Yeah.
And this was being...
The challenge to me is he moved out of the blessing into the wickedness.
Mm-hmm. He did. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. All right. I think we have time for one more. This is chapter 14. I'm going to summarize it for you instead of read it all out loud. But Lot has moved himself and all his people over to this well-watered place, the beautiful place of Sodom, right? He's living there. Well, there's a number of kings, and they did this often during, I think, harvest time. A number of kings that came together, and they attacked other kings to try to get territory, right? And so Lot, and with the rest of the Sodomites, are caught in the middle of this big battle between all these kings, and Lot is kidnapped. Abram feels the need to get him back. And so he gathers a small army of his own servants, 318 of his own people from his own household. And he travels during the night up, and he takes them by surprise. He divvies up his men. He takes those by surprise who had kidnapped Lot and won the war. He defeats them, and he ends up saving Lot. But God saves the land for Abram. So God comes through in this way, and let's look at verse 17. Abram's coming back down, and he has not only Lot and his possessions, but he has all of the people that were taken all as slaves, and he has all of the loot. He's This is how you got rich. You defeated people and you took all their stuff, right? And so he now has all this stuff that he's carrying back from that used to be the people of Sodom's and other kings. This is verse 17. After Abram returned from defeating Kedorlaomer, should have practiced that, and the kings allied with him, the king of Sodom came out to meet him in the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High, and he blessed Abram, saying, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and praise be to God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hands. Then Abram gave him a tenth of everything. The king of Sodom said to Abram, Give me the people and keep the goods for yourself. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, with raised hand, I have sworn an oath to the Lord God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, that I will accept nothing belonging to you, not even a thread or a strap of a sandal, so that you will not be able to say, I made Abram rich. I will accept nothing but what my men have eaten and the share that belongs to the men who were with me, to Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre. Let them have their share. Do you see a threat there that the king of Sodom is bringing to Abram? Compromise in what way? Yeah, let's do it, Mike.
So raise your hand, please.
God will provide everything Abram needs. He has promised it.
Yes.
Yep.
That's the promise of the heritage.
Yeah,
I will make your name great.
Yeah, and we're accustomed to grabbing when it's offered. This will help me out. Surely God is in this.
Yeah, that's good. That was the danger, to try to find the blessing that God had offered through other means. And Abram was fortunate because right before he meets the king of Sodom, he meets Melchizedek. First time we meet Melchizedek in the scriptures, and he becomes a big figure later. Melchizedek is the priest of El Elyon, God Most High. And he comes and he blesses Abraham. And he says, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. That word creator can also, and this is what I think it means, mean possessor. God is the possessor of heaven and earth. He owns everything. He controls everything, and Abram is being blessed by God. And so Abram realizes, God's going to take care of me. He's going to make this heritage happen. I don't have to go my own way. God will make my name great, God who owns everything. Now, we have just a couple minutes, and I don't want to try to cram too much in, but I did, since we're here, want to take a break and talk about Melchizedek a little bit. What do we know about Melchizedek? Not enough, not much. He was the king of Salem, which most people think was Jerusalem before it became Jerusalem. He was the priest. He was both a king and a priest. His name means king of righteousness, Melchizedek. The author of Hebrews explains what his name means. And he was the priest of God Most High, who the scriptures take as being the one true God, Yahweh. Okay? In the Psalms, it almost seems random. In Psalm 110, Melchizedek is mentioned. Okay, so that psalm starts out, the Lord said to my Lord, David saying, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. And then he says, I will make you a priest forever in the line of Melchizedek. Now, that psalm is the most quoted psalm in the New Testament. They take that as so important, Psalm 110. And Hebrews, let's turn over there and we'll end with this after we're done here. Hebrews chapter 6. This is verse 20. He's trying to explain how Jesus can not only be the king, but can be the high priest of Christians. Because Jesus was from the line of Judah, And all high priests were supposed to come from the line of Levi. So how can he be a high priest, like people say? How can he be the one that mediates between God and people if that's not his job? That's supposed to be the Levites. So the author of Hebrews makes a long argument about how Jesus comes in the line not of Levi, but of Melchizedek, who was even before Levi existed. So this is verse 20 of chapter 6. I'll start in verse 19. We have this hope as an anchor for the soul, firm and secure. It enters the inner sanctuary behind the curtain, where our forerunner, Jesus, has entered on our behalf. He has become a high priest forever, in the order of Melchizedek. Then in chapter 7, the whole thing is about Jesus' relation to Melchizedek. And he makes 3 points. We're not going to read the whole thing. You can if you want. But these are, two major points. Melchizedek is a greater priest than Levi because he came first. So he actually says, Abram gave Melchizedek a tenth of everything. And Levi was just still in Abram's body, is how he puts it. And so Levi is basically giving Melchizedek a tenth. It's a complicated way of thinking things and not how we think of things. But he's saying even Levi kind of accepted and submitted to the high priesthood of Melchizedek back in chapter 14 of Genesis. And the second is this. Jesus, though he's not in the line of Levi, he follows after Melchizedek because, verse 3, without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life, resembling the Son of God, he remains a priest forever. And so this person who just Abraham randomly met, it seems like, and who blessed him and Abram gave a tithe to, became a huge figure in New Testament theology and the proof that Jesus is not just the king of the world, but the high priest, mediator between God and people. And in Jewish thinking around Jesus' time, a lot of people thought there'd be two messiahs, one from the line of Judah and one to be a priest, an anointed one from the line of Levi. And the author of Hebrews says, nope, they're the same person. It's all Jesus. Any questions? Yes, Mike.
So then, who is Melchizedek? Has no beginning or end of age. Is he a theophany of the Lord Jesus Christ appearing in those days, or I mean?
I don't know. That's actually the point that he makes. The author of Hebrews is saying we don't know where this guy came from. We don't know when he died. He just seems like he's an eternal priest, and so is Jesus. He is eternal, without beginning, without end. That's why he's in that line. There's a lot you could say, there's a lot you could ponder, but it's cool. He's a cool guy. And on that, yeah, okay. Jim, yeah, it's good not to end with that. Jim, say something better than that. Hold on, here's a mic.
This is one of the great things about heaven, is that when we don't have a glimpse of what the power and the glory of God and everything, or the IQ to figure out what they're saying in this thing, and we get to go up there and we get to be taught by the Master, and I can't wait. And then if I go before you, I'll try to tell you what's going on. Okay.
That sounds good. Show me the ropes. All right. Thanks everybody for coming, for listening. See you later.